June is National Indigenous History Month, and in keeping with that theme, a new book aims to educate readers on the history, heritage, and diversity of Canada's First Peoples. Lynda Gray is a member of the Tsimshian Nation on the northwest coast of BC. She is also the author of First Nations 101, now in its second edition, and she joins me now. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, John. Good morning.
Good morning. As mentioned, this is actually the second edition of the book. Why come out with it now?
Well, I kind of feel like reconciliation in this country is moving at a snail's pace, despite government's commitments, stated commitments. And the Truth and Reconciliation report came out 7 years ago, and the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls came out 3 years ago, and yet not a lot has happened since then. And whenever I do public talks, people usually ask the question or come and talk to me and say that they want to contribute to reconciliation, but they don't know what to do. They don't have enough knowledge, or they feel shy, or they feel fear, or they feel awkward. So one of the new chapters in the book is how to become a great ally, so people can learn how to contribute without waiting for government to make movements.
So much has happened between this, the original and this new book. As you mentioned, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's also the inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Canada adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And of course, last year, the confirmation of unmarked graves at residential school sites in Kamloops and elsewhere. Which of these do you think had the greatest impact on the Indigenous community?
On the Indigenous community, I would say all of them, but the most hard-hitting was probably the discovery of the unmarked graves, because a lot of Indigenous people have said for decades that there were kids that never came home, and that they knew of kids who had died. So there's so many people who are still alive who knew some of those kids. It was their child or their uncle or their aunt or their grandfather. So I think it hit very close to home for a lot more Indigenous people. But also watching the survivors and the witnesses at the inquiry and the commission was very moving also, because it helped for us to make sense of our lives and to know that Canada finally will be able to hear the truth about what happened, and made us hopeful that things could change.
Now, when we talk about the intended audience of this book, it's not just Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, it's everyone, really.
Yes, yep, for sure. And I wrote it the way I wrote it last time, that I really tried to make it accessible, short pieces of information so that anybody can use it. And I'm especially hopeful that here in BC, which the high school curriculum is going to change in the 23-24 year, that every high school student is going to be required to take a course on Indigenous history and culture. So I think that this is the perfect book for it. There's a couple of high schools that are using it already and find it really helpful as an accessible, not too scary, I guess, or overwhelming kind of thing for a young person to learn. But I think businesses can use it, government can use it, and we as Indigenous people need to read it so that we understand our lives a bit more and how we came to be here, because we're immersed in the issues, but it doesn't mean that we understand them all.
That's right. And you say in the book, we must learn about and understand our shared history with Canadians and reclaim the beliefs, cultures, and traditions of our ancestors so we can live more healthy, respectful, prosperous, cultural, and interconnected lives. How important is it for you, for Indigenous people, to pick up this book?
I think that is really important because we don't understand what happened. Like, we know that maybe our parent or our grandparent was affected by residential schools, but they don't understand that that's why we lost our language. That's why they maybe have an addiction issue. That's maybe why they're angry. So being able to understand why we grew up the way that we did, and we don't have to live in poverty, and we don't have to be displaced from our homelands and our culture and our language, it really is important, because it's very empowering once you learn this stuff. I know it was for myself.
And the book is a starting point for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike. You also make the distinction between the terms Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So because I used to think that Indigenous and First Nations were terms that you could use interchangeably, but that's not the case at all.
Well, I think it is when you talk to the average Indigenous person, but government and First Nations, like band-based people, they've been changing the way they've been using because government demands that they do in terms of funding. So they've been kind of separating that word out a bit more, First Nations. But I chose to call the book First Nations 101 because no matter how people say we got here, whether we, came over the Bering Strait or we came by canoe or we were dropped out of a helicopter or a spaceship, we were the First Nations that were here, and we are independent nations. So I still use First Nations, but I also use Indigenous because it means we're Indigenous to this land.
So Indigenous is the umbrella term for everyone.
Yes, that's what most Indigenous people have been saying for, a long time, that if you're going to use anything, we don't want you to be using all the other words that government has chosen. We actually want to say this is what in the umbrella term, as you said, can be used, but we all prefer to be called our own Indigenous nation.
Very good. Another question the book takes on, and you mentioned this earlier, is reconciliation. How do you define it? Number one. Number two, is it possible?
I think reconciliation is possible, like maybe not on a countrywide level for a long time, like many decades. It's going to take just as much time and human and financial and other resources as it took going into, 200 years of assimilation policies that ran residential schools, that set up the Indian Act and set up, the Department of Indian Affairs, all of that sort of thing. But I think on one-to-one basis, you and I in this interview right now is an act of reconciliation. So it may seem like a small thing, but it really is a big thing, because 20 years ago, nobody would have cared what an Indigenous woman had to say. And so you have some people who are, trying to give land back. And I'm talking about reconciliation as a path that everybody needs to walk. So, it's a continuum from where you maybe you're not interested in meeting Indigenous people or can't for whatever reason, but you send a $10 check into the Urban Native Youth Association, and then all the way to along the other end of the continuum where we're talking about land back. So there was a rancher here in BC who gave half of his land back to the local First Nations. It was like 300 acres or something. So I think everybody, including Indigenous people, have to move along that continuum during their lifetime, doing what they can as close to land back as possible. So I might not be able to give land back to the local First Nations here in Vancouver, but I can contribute to the Urban Native Youth Association's capital campaign to build a youth center. That might be as close as I can get. So there's many, many ways that people can contribute to reconciliation.
And you use an interesting word there. It's a continuum, but it's also a path. So it's something that can be worked towards. And there's a concept in the book as well. What you do now affects 7 generations in the future. So reconciliation isn't something that I understand it to be something that'll happen tomorrow or overnight, but it's something that continues to happen and will continue to happen.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a path that the survivors from the TRC and the inquiry have laid for us. Like they've said, the truth is now the foundation. We need to walk down that road together, and we need to do things differently. And I think the more one-to-one reconciliation that we can have, we're having this conversation, and maybe with a business. I've been doing stuff recently with the Vancouver Opera, of all places. Who would have thought that I'd be doing that? You know what I mean? So the more individual acts that they are, it's going to become a greater whole. So it's not time limited. It's not a destination. It's a process.
And one of the chapters in the book, as you mentioned earlier, how to become a great ally, and that's a part of reconciliation as well. What do you think makes a great ally?
Well, I think first, a person can't just declare that they're an ally. They need to become an ally with ongoing support and action. And an ally, for my purposes, is that somebody who joins others and supports their goals. And it really is about, in this case with Indigenous people, is listening to what Indigenous people want to do and trying to help them reach their goals, and never appropriating the knowledge that you have, And so I'm going to be having this chapter free in PDF on my website, because I think it's so important to give people the tools that they say that they want so that they can contribute to reconciliation. And reconciliation really is about becoming a great ally.
And the final chapter is titled The Way Forward, Paddling Together. And an important distinction you make in here is we cannot wait for government to fix things. only individuals, groups, and businesses can do that. So what can we do, picking up on this idea of being an ally, what can we do on an individual level then for this way forward?
We'll really learn about the true history in Canada. And a lot of Indigenous people have podcasts and blogs and YouTube channels and other things. So really it's about educating ourselves. It's about reconciling for ourselves any privilege that we may have had in our lives, even if we didn't realize it, but we may have benefited from. And it's about joining with Indigenous people to help them reach their goals. And it's much, much broader than that, but that's kind of the basis of what needs to be done. Now,
having said that, you do have a list of things for governments that they can and should do. Where should they start?
They should, well, for the federal government, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it's not good enough to just enable an act. You actually have to actionize. You have to activate it. You have to meaningfully implement it. So there's many things that still haven't been done there. And same thing here in BC, DRIPA, their provincial act is, they've been slowly moving towards things, but they need to move a lot quicker. And government needs to listen to Indigenous people about what it is that we say is important in our lives, rather than, again, just trying to say, oh, this is how we're going to get you employed. This is how we're going to get you into cities. They need to stop doing that. So the only government programs that have really done well are ones that Indigenous people have kind of taken over and implemented in the way that they wanted to, which is few and far between opportunities to do that. So it's a lot more listening. The Creator gave us 2 ears for a reason and 1 mouth, so we only talk once, but actually listen to Indigenous people.
And ultimately, what do you hope readers get out of the book?
I hope that they get a better understanding of how Canada came to be where it is today. It is a shared history. You can't talk about treaties or salmon or lobster or salmon farms without it being something that affects all of us. It's not just about Indigenous people. And the more that they understand, the first 2 chapters in the book are so important. It's the foundation of understanding what our communities used to look like. We used to be independent people. We had our own economies. We were proud, we were healthy, we had strong tribal and family systems. We need people to see us as we were so that they know that's what we can be again, as long as a bunch of barriers are taken down and we're allowed to turn back to our ways, which a lot of people are now referring to as rematriation. It's to turn back towards our cultural ways.
The name of the book is First Nations 101. My thanks to author Lynda Gray.
Okay, thank you, John.